welcome back to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine. One of the most common things I hear from parents, and it is a source of frustration for them for sure, is how can my child not see what everyone else sees? How is their reality of things so different than everyone else around them? It might be a parent telling me about their teenager who lives with a neurobehavioral condition, being seemingly oblivious to their friend's feelings and then wonders why that friend never wants to hang out. Or a child who melts down because they can't understand why their sibling gets something different. Or a tween that becomes absolutely furious when asked to agree to a slight change of plans because it is better for the larger group that's involved. Parents in these situations often wonder, is my kid really that selfish? Do they truly not care about anyone else but themselves? Today, I want to offer you a different possibility of what might be happening. What if what you're seeing isn't selfishness at all? What if you're seeing a lagging cognitive skill called perspective taking? And what if your child's brain is genuinely struggling to see beyond their own experience at that moment? So let's talk for a moment about what exactly perspective taking is. It's a cognitive skill, and it's an essential relational cognitive skill. We've talked about relational cognitive skills on this podcast before. If you haven't listened to episode 40 of the Brain First Parenting Podcast, it's all about relational cognitive skills. I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes so that you can listen to it after you're done with this episode. So perspective taking is essential when it comes to being in relationships with other people. It's the ability to understand that another person may have thoughts and feelings, needs, experiences, or viewpoints that are different from our own. It's the ability to mentally step outside of ourselves and imagine what life looks like from someone else's position. For many children, this develops gradually over time, and we expect that to be the case as their parents. We don't expect our toddler, for example, to be able to do this. And when our toddler, who's 2 or 3 or 4, is not taking into consideration other people's perspectives, it doesn't make us panic. We know that that's developmentally where they are. It's a skill that they just don't have yet at that age. And as they mature, we're very confident that this skill will develop. But for kids with neurobehavioral differences, this skill may develop more slowly. It is perhaps less consistent. It requires much more cognitive effort. Seen through a behavioral lens, it looks like they are selfish, that they don't care about anyone else but themselves. Through a science-informed, brain-first lens, we can see more clearly what's actually happening. It's a brain that works differently, and this is one of the ways that it works differently. Perspective taking is a brain function. I want to talk a little bit about the research behind that. Research shows that perspective taking depends on a network of brain regions working together. I'm going to talk briefly about this because I don't think it's actually important to this conversation to get into the weeds. I certainly don't want to overwhelm you with that information, but I think it's important to recognize there is research that shows us perspective taking is connected to brain regions, and they need to work efficiently and effectively in order for perspective taking to happen. When we talk about the research of this brain behavior connection, it really helps solidify for us as parents, okay, there is a reason behind this. It isn't about my child's character. One of the brain's jobs is to help us move from what's happening to me to what's happening for you. For some children, that shift, again, happens automatically as they mature over time. For others, especially children with neurobehavioral differences, that shift requires much more effort. And it isn't always available in the moment that that child really needs it. The brain helps us think about what other people might be feeling, thinking, worrying about, and experiencing. Related to this is something researchers call mirror neuron systems. This network helps us understand the actions and intentions of other people by internally simulating what they're doing. So together, these systems help us understand questions like, what is she thinking? Why did he do that? What might they be feeling right now? Without these networks working efficiently, perspective taking becomes much, much harder. And for many of our kids, these systems are developing differently because their brain has developed differently for one reason or another. The other piece of neuroscience research that I think is really helpful in understanding this lagging cognitive skill is that the brain's default setting is egocentric. Findings from developmental research tell us that the brain naturally starts from an egocentric position. Not egocentric in the sense of being self-centered, egocentric in the sense that we all initially experience the world from our own point of view. To understand another's perspective, the brain has to actively suppress its own viewpoint first. I want you to think about that for a moment. The brain doesn't automatically begin with, what is mom experiencing right now? Or how is my brother or sister impacted by what I'm doing? Or what I'm insisting happens in this moment? The brain begins with, what am I experiencing right now? Then it has to shift. And that shift requires cognitive work. It requires the brain to consistently, efficiently, and move as the world expects it to, work as the world expects it to. For some children and tweens and teens, that skill isn't developed enough for them to do this automatically and independently because of the ways their brain works differently. Most especially when they are stressed or tired or anxious, overwhelmed, hungry, dysregulated, that shift may simply not happen. A parent recently described to me a situation with her teenage daughter, and this parent was caring for a 5-month-old grandchild of hers, and the baby was crying. So my client was telling me how she was trying to soothe the baby. Meanwhile, her teenage daughter repeatedly demanded lunch. And my client explained to her teenager that she needed to help the baby first, and then she would be able to help her daughter with lunch. Her daughter became increasingly frustrated, basically throwing what my client described as a toddler fit in a teenage body. And from the outside, it might look like her teenager is saying, I don't care that the baby is crying. It looks so selfish, so self-centered. But maybe that's not what's happening at all. What may be happening is that her teen's brain is fully locked into one reality, which is her reality. I'm hungry. I need food immediately. The brain is struggling to simultaneously hold the perspective of I'm hungry and the baby is distressed. And the baby is, well, a baby. And I'm a teenager. So of course mom's going to help the baby first. And mom is trying her best to help us both. Mom only has one body, can only do so much in this moment. My needs can wait a few minutes. I will be okay. Perspective taking requires all of those pieces to be held together at once. Not to mention drawing upon other cognitive skills in this moment, like emotional regulation skills or cognitive flexibility. That's a really heavy cognitive load for many of our kids whose brain works differently. Which leads me to another important piece of this puzzle, that perspective taking doesn't operate independently. As I said, it depends on other brain skills working well. One of those that I mentioned already is cognitive flexibility. We talked about this skill set in episode 3 of this podcast. I'll note that in the show notes for you as well. But a piece about cognitive flexibility, it is the ability to mentally shift gears, to move from my perspective to someone else's perspective. Working memory is also involved. We covered working memory in episode 32 of this podcast. This is when the brain has to hold another person's situation in mind while simultaneously keeping track of its own. If working memory is weak, the child's own needs often dominate, simply because that's what's easiest for the brain to keep track of. This is why many children can seem very understanding one day and completely oblivious the next. The skill isn't consistently available. Another key ingredient here is impulse control. The brain has to inhibit or suppress its immediate first-person perspective. That's hard. And again, think of your experiences with much younger children where developmentally they do not have this skill. you can see how hard it is for them, how they throw a fit or they melt down when they are bumping up against an expectation that requires them to do this and they're not able to. They don't have the skills yet to do it. This is all especially hard when emotions are high. So think about the last time you were exhausted or stressed or worried or overwhelmed in some way. Were you at your absolute best when it came to understanding everyone else's needs? Probably not. Not because you're a bad person, but because your brain was going offline a bit due to that stress and that overwhelm, and your cognitive skills, like perspective taking, weren't as accessible to you. You're human. Our children are no different. They are human too. Where they are different is that many of them are working with less mature neural systems and fewer cognitive resources to begin with. Here's an important point, and I actually think from a science perspective, it's a really fascinating piece of the brain and perspective taking. It's not just about recognizing others' people's experiences and feelings. Perspective taking also includes understanding another person's physical viewpoint. So researchers often study this using visual perspective taking tasks. For example, can a child understand that what they see from one side of the room is different from what someone else sees from another side? This requires visuospatial processing. The brain literally has to mentally rotate an image to another vantage point. Interestingly, some kids, tweens and teens included, who struggle with social perspective taking also struggle with visual perspective taking tasks. So the challenge isn't always empathy. Sometimes it's the underlying ability to mentally shift visual perspectives too. So I imagine many of you are like, yes, this resonates. You are talking about my kids, so what do I do about it? Which is a great question. When we interpret perspective taking difficulties as disrespect or selfishness, manipulation, a lack of caring, we often respond with correction. That's what we do from a behavioral lens. We lecture, we punish, we tell kids to, think about someone else for a change. We ask them questions they can't answer, like what were you thinking, or how do you think that made them feel? This is when we have to remind ourselves that this is a lagging cognitive skill at play, and correction does not build the skill. It only creates shame. That doesn't mean we let go of our expectations here. It means we change how we support our kids in meeting those expectations. So how do we help? I want to give you a few ideas on how you might help your child, your teen, tween, or teen build this skill. First is narrating perspectives. Don't assume your child sees them. Explain them, make them very overt, very concrete. The baby is crying because she's uncomfortable. I'm helping her first, then I'm going to help you. When your sister is telling me about her day, but you keep interrupting her story, it's frustrating to her because she was talking first. My brain is trying to solve two problems right now. I can only focus on one, and then I'll focus on yours. I know you were upset, but what you said to your brother, it hurt his feelings. And this is why. When we say X, Y, and Z, this is how the other person feels that or receives that. Second, making the invisible information visible. Many kids, again, even tweens and teens with neurobehavioral challenges, need explicit explanations that other people have needs and thoughts and worries and pressures. Those things do not automatically show up on their radar. Third, using curiosity instead of judgment. This takes a lot of practice. We can so easily get stuck in a cycle of automatically reacting to behaviors. So be gentle with yourself as you continue to practice getting that space that we're always talking about here on this podcast between their behavior and our reaction. And when you're able to get that space, can you fill it with curiosity? So instead of this automatic reaction that we are so prone to of they are so selfish, asking, okay, what information might their brain be missing right now? The fourth suggestion, practicing perspective taking when nobody is upset. Talking about characters in movies. Wonder about motives. Asking questions like, what do you think she was feeling? Or what do you think he thought was happening? What information did each person have? These conversations that happen outside of the challenging moment, they strengthen the neural pathways involved in perspective taking. Finally, remembering, as we are often reminded on this podcast, that a regulated nervous system comes first. A regulated nervous system comes before perspective taking. When your child or your tween or teen is dysregulated, their brain becomes even more self-focused. Again, that's not because they're choosing selfishness, but it's because survival always narrows attention. The more regulated the nervous system becomes, the more available perspective taking becomes. Okay, so some closing thoughts on this as we wrap up this episode. What this all comes down to, in a nutshell, is making this very essential but powerful shift from a behavioral lens to a brain first lens. We're moving from my child won't consider anyone else and always does what they want to my child may not yet be able to consistently access the perspective of others. Those are two very different interpretations. One assumes a character flaw. The other recognizes a developing brain skill. And when we understand perspective taking as a brain-based capacity rather than a moral failing, we stop asking, why are they so selfish? And instead, we start asking, how can I support the development of this really essential skill? That's the brain first lens in a nutshell, and it truly changes everything. Thanks as always for being here. I'm so grateful that you continue to listen in. And until next time, take care.